Hello, my name is Jason Linville. This is a lecture on forensic anthropology being recorded for JS 110 Introduction to Forensic Science at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. This lecture is being recorded in the fall of 2017, so if you're accessing this archive lecture in future semesters, all the material still applies. But if I mention anything about Thanksgiving or 2017, then you can ignore all of that stuff. All right. Where we're at in this course in JS 110, no matter what semester you're in, is we've probably already done all of the traditional areas of forensic science in a lab. You trace evidence, DNA, drugs, toxicology, even question documents, tread analysis, fingerprints, and now we're moving on to these related fields. Now, depending on the semester, like in fall of 2017, we are actually talking about forensic pathology, a medical examiner, death investigation. The name of that lecture varies. And also forensic anthropology. So if you remember from the beginning of the semester when we talked about forensic science and education, these are fields where it's not just a biologist or chemist who can be hired by the forensic anthropology section of a crime lab. Forensic anthropologists typically study anthropology, go to graduate school for anthropology, and they're professional research scientists that occasionally contribute to casework. And the reason for that is that forensic anthropology cases are so different, you really can't make a direct comparison. You can't, if you're trying to determine the biological sex of skeletal remains, you can't necessarily pull out a skeleton of an identical, age and size, stature, race out of a drawer and make a direct side-by-side comparison to see if the traits match. There's a lot of variation of the traits within different groups. So that's why a forensic anthropologist doesn't just have to have experience, but also needs to be very familiar with the research literature that will help them out when making decisions to help out law enforcement. All right, so I asked everybody to throw a 2 or 3 sentence case into the chat box. And so let's see what people think of when we, when we hear forensic entomology. Okay, the first one, Sarah says a bone found in a wooded area, and local law enforcement wants the area search for other bones that may be buried, so they call in a forensic anthropologist. And this is one thing a forensic anthropologist can do. They can actually assist with locating remains, and if a bone is found in a wooded area, the forensic anthropologist can also tell the investigators, hey, this is a human bone versus a deer bone. You're probably not going to have a big search, if somebody finds a deer bone in the forest. All right, Jamie says somebody's fishing and caught a skull. Okay, so that's the old variation on the boot. Okay, if a skull comes up, then same question. Is this a human skull? A forensic anthropologist can answer that, and maybe we need to go into the lake and look for the rest of the human remains. Also, we want to know whose bone is it? Whose skull is it? All right, Madeline says forensic anthropology can be used to determine the age and sex of the skeletons. So again, a dog digs up a shallow grave, and not only do we want to know if it's human, but also what do we know? Essentially we want to know, is this human? And if it is human, who is it? Okay, and if the who is it question is too difficult to answer, then like some of the other areas of forensic science we talked about, we need some assistance to help guide us in our investigation. Like if we find a mysterious shoe print at a crime scene and we can't identify whose shoe it is, then we want to know, okay, what is the brand name? Where is this shoe sold? Maybe that can help out our investigation. All right, Patrick says hiking in the woods with a dog, and he brings back a human femur. Sarah says a couple of teeth found at a crime scene. So you guys are, on the right path with thinking about forensic anthropology, where it's just human remains are found, and they need a professional to assist with the who, what, why, where, when, and how, or something like that. So let's go ahead and take a look. Now, as I promised here, the forensic anthropology lecture is a little bit shorter than some of the other ones. So let's not make it any longer than it needs to, Dr. Linville. I want to get these 5 points and be on my way to do whatever it is people do on a Tuesday night. Okay. So recovering human remains, we mentioned that. I need to move my chat box because I can't find the slide. Notify human remains? No, that's not what that says. Identify human remains and determine the time or cause of death. Forensic anthropologists can help with all of these, although the time and cause of death, as we're going to see, can be a little bit difficult for a forensic anthropologist. Okay, as I already mentioned at the top of the lecture and as we had in the forensic education lecture, it's important to remember that forensic anthropologists are specialists in physical anthropology. So not only, it's not like they just have a bachelor's degree in anthropology, because there's a lot of different areas of anthropology that one can focus on. Cultural anthropologists would be a lot different from a physical anthropologist. So when we say physical anthropology, what we mean is, as it says, there's a study of human biological function and variation, skeletal biology. So in all of our examples, we have human remains turning up and needing a forensic anthropologist to assist law enforcement with gaining knowledge from these human remains. So a forensic anthropologist often learns skills in archaeological methods. What that means is it's not just looking at the skeletal remains and being able to identify who they are or a little bit about the size, stature, biological sex, or race of the individual, but it's also the recovering of human remains as well. Forensic anthropologists are trained there. Okay, so it's not just the analysis. Because I guess the analogy would be, I mentioned that for a lot of crime scene work, like in Alabama, they tend to keep their drug chemists and DNA scientists in the lab to do the analysis because they feel that law enforcement can be trained to recover or collect evidence at the crime scene. With recovery of human remains, it can be a little bit more difficult, as we're going to see that there are benefits to having a professional forensic anthropologist at the scene. Sorry, now I'm having cat issues. All right. Forensic anthropologists, they do gain experience by working in universities or museums, so it's not as though they can only work in, only conduct research, but they also do some casework as well. And typically with a forensic anthropologist, it's like a lot of these other fields that we're finding later in the semester as we talk about them. There's an organization, academic society, and for forensic anthropologists in America, it's the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. And this is a group of professional anthropologists who will look at the work experience, education of an individual applying for certification and sort of say, okay, yes, you're one of us. You have demonstrated to us, forensic anthropologists who know what we're talking about, that you're capable of conducting casework analysis. And then once somebody gets certified by the American Board of Forensic Anthropology, then they are, that forensic anthropologist is able to accept casework, go into court and testify, and not have to face scrutiny of, hey, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. They took a couple anthropology courses and they read a book and they're pretending they know what they're doing. All right, here's a map, and this is an older map. So you can see, I think this is 1996 is the date. I haven't really tried to find a current map, but it's not as though this map is generated every year. The new annual Forensic Anthropologists in America and Canada map. But what this map does show is that the frequency of forensic anthropologists are not abundant throughout the United States. In fact, many states do have 0 forensic anthropologists in them. Alabama was a 0 state, although Dr. Wheatley at UAB was a physical anthropologist and did some forensic work. But the point is, you're not going to go into a local crime lab and say, take me to your forensic anthropologist. So this is one of these areas where if Jefferson or Birmingham City Police found human remains on Ruffner Mountain, somebody's hiking in Ruffner Mountain, they're not going to send them to Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences and have the state forensic anthropologists look at them. The evidence will still go to the state lab, but then they'll probably contract out with a forensic anthropologist if they need that type of analysis done. So anthropologists participate. Hey, look, notice that right here. Okay, this would not be a bad gig. I think, what is that, University of Hawaii? Why is my mouse? It's going to look like I've been drinking. My mouse is, I think the batteries are running low. I've been having issues with that today. But hey, being a forensic anthropologist in Hawaii would not be a bad gig, would it? Anthropologists, as we have already mentioned several times, can help out with searches and collection of human remains with law enforcement. The main thing here is if I'm going out, let's say I find a bone in the woods. Okay, I don't know if it's animal or human. And then I start looking around for other bones. I'm going to collect like every white rock that I see. And I may see sort of a brownish bone that I think is just a clump of dirt. Okay, so because I don't have experience in identifying what is or is not a bone, it's not like fingerprints where it's easy to train somebody on how to dust for fingerprints or look for blood. It's a red liquid, okay? You don't necessarily need extensive training for that. But for bones, especially if it's bone that's been buried for a while, that can become just identifying what is important, what is evidence and what is a rock, can be pretty difficult. All right. When it comes to locating human remains, there are instruments or animals that can assist forensic anthropologists and law enforcement. So cadaver dogs are trained to hit on the scent of decomposing human remains, and as with most things that are done, I don't know how to phrase this, but forensic anthropologists, we as humans think, oh, well, if a dog can do it, surely we can make a machine that does it. And here's one attempt at a machine like that. Because the dog, I mean, it's certain compounds in the air from human remains that are hitting the dog's nose, and the dog recognizes those compounds and then therefore can find the decomposing human remains. So you think you could build a sensor that is able to detect very tiny levels of molecules and be able to sort of find, calibrate it to detect decomposing human remain volatile organic compounds. But it's one of those easier said than done things. Dogs still work very good, and the machine in this area has not quite caught up yet. Other instruments, I forget if we have another slide here. Well, this sort of shows it. But if a body is buried underground, then there are also sort of X-ray instruments that forensic anthropologists are trained to find that can detect where the ground has been disturbed. If you want to go on even a larger scale, Dr. Parkak, I always pronounce Sarah's name incorrectly at UAB, who is won the TED Award, I think that was just last year, and does a lot of work with using satellite imagery to detect disturbances, to detect essentially grave robbers or people who are digging up important archaeological sites in order to just recover things, sell on the black market, using global imagery to detect where the earth has been disturbed, where digging has gone, sort of looking at before and after pictures. So for locating human remains, it's sort of done not with satellite imagery, but on a smaller scale where forensic anthropologists can detect sort of where vegetation looks unusual, indicating that a grave has been dug recently at a certain site. Excuse me. And then when it comes time to actually recovering the human remains, this is another area, like I mentioned previously, that forensic anthropologists can be a big help with, not just identifying what is or is not a bone, but also if it's a person that has been buried while wearing clothing, the clothing may contain blood stains on it, other biological stains on it, may contain trace evidence that could be helpful to an investigation. But if you've ever buried a piece of fabric and then dug it up later, I don't know, there may be a situation where you're digging up something in the yard and it had fabric attached to it, but fabric tends to decompose. So this clothing may be very important evidence, but if it's just you or I out there digging up human remains with a couple of shovels, we're going to break bones, we're going to miss bones, we're going to collect things that aren't bones, and also if there's any clothing associated, we're probably just going to grind it up with a bunch of the other dirt. So it's a matter of anthropologists using these sort of like the paleontologists out looking for dinosaur bones, where they have the earth sectioned off into squares, and they very carefully sift through the dirt to find important materials. Anthropologists have these skills, and they have learned how to recover human remains. And then obviously that last bullet there, map the location and maintain chain of custody, they are also trained with how to properly document a crime scene as well, because a document with human remains is going to be a little bit, or documenting crime scene with human remains is going to be a little bit different from your run-of-the-mill homicide scene, indoor homicide scene. Okay, so human or non-human? This is one of the first questions a forensic anthropologist has to answer, and it's been a while since I put these pictures in here. I used to know the answers. I think it's human on the left, human in the middle, and non-human on the right, or maybe all of these are human. I don't know. But hey, that's why we need a forensic anthropologist, okay? Because it takes a lot of training being able to look at a bone and be able to tell whether it's human or non-human. My favorite story for the non-human aspect of forensic anthropology is several years ago there was a story on the news, local news, and I think it was Ruffner Mountain, where it was like somebody found a baby's foot in the woods, more tomorrow. So you have to go to bed thinking, oh, where's the rest of the baby, and why was it a foot, and who found it, and what happened? Okay, well, what actually happened in that case, they brought the baby foot into UAB, and Dr. Wheatley, who was a trained physical anthropologist, took one look at it, and he goes, no, this is a bear foot. Okay, and it turns out that bears' feet resemble human feet for some reason. So it wasn't crazy that the person picked up this foot and thought it was a tiny baby foot, but it turned out that it was a tiny bear foot. Okay, maybe a bear cub that didn't make it through childbirth or something along those lines. But anyhow, it was a case where you heard it on the news, and it was a question that forensic anthropologists could very quickly answer as far as whether it's bones or not bones. Now, if it's not human and the forensic anthropologist wants to try to identify the species, there are reference collections that they can, borrow or send a bone to, somebody who's maybe more skilled with identifying deer bones, because it's not as though a forensic anthropologist has every single bone of every single species memorized. Now, they're probably very familiar with all the different human bones, and they can recognize what may or may not be a human phalange, in the finger versus a wing bone from a bird. I don't know. So they can make, but it's not as though if they find a small bone from a deer, they're immediately going to be able to recognize it as a deer bone. So these reference collections of both humans and different animals are something where they can pull a drawer open with a bunch of bones in it and do a side-by-side comparison of their unknown sample, the bone, and the known sample, whatever species they're looking at, to try to make an identification. All right. The other thing forensic anthropologists will do, so at this point, let's assume that it is human. Okay, obviously, there are additional questions that the forensic anthropologist needs to answer. The main one, who is this? Okay, they may go through a list of missing persons to get a general idea of who it is. But if the human remains do not have any identification associated with, a driver's license is always nice to find with human remains, or if there's no individual characteristics that we'll see in a couple slides here, then if the forensic anthropologist can't make an identification, this person is, John Smith, then they'll develop a biological profile, which essentially is just a report that includes everything that they know about the human remains, even if it means sort of taking some education guesses on some of the areas. So the first thing to look at is age, and try to determine the age of the individual. This can be very difficult to do unless it's younger, because once bones reach late teenage or maximum growth, then it's not as though the bones change much from a 20-year-old versus a 40-year-old. But in younger, human remains, different bones fused together. In children, the head bones are loose, and then they eventually fuse together. Bone length, obviously that's affected by the size of the individual as well. But sort of a child's human remains of a child are going to look a little bit different than human remains of a small adult the same height. They can also tell the biological sex depending on the type of bone that's recovered. Now, it is possible, although we don't get too much into it in this lecture, to take a DNA sample from bone, and there you could tell the biological sex. But if you have the right type of bones, the skull, as it says there, skull, pelvis, male skulls look different than female skulls. The male pelvis looks different from the female pelvis. And then there are some features on other bones like the femur that you can tell the difference. But if it's where you just have a couple finger bones, it may be very difficult to tell the difference between male and female. So you really need the right type of bone for the forensic anthropologist. The stature of an individual, you may say, well, hey, you just measure, stand up the skeleton and measure the height. Well, what if you only have the feet, or what if you only have a couple bones from the arm? There, again, you or I can't necessarily look at those and determine the stature or the size or estimate the height of the individual, but a forensic anthropologist can take that little information they have and draw some general conclusions about the person. Ancestry, basically that means the race of the individual. Again, there are features that are indicate that they may be of African descent versus Asian descent versus European descent, so Native American. And when it comes to ancestry, again, it's not identifying necessarily the correct race of the individual with 100% certainty, but it's a matter of just including certain features that were noticed in the skeletal remains, including those on the report. Bill Bass, who we'll mention here a little bit when it comes to estimating the age of human remains, gave a talk at Birmingham Southern College because he wrote a book with Jefferson, that's not right, Jim Jefferson, I think. Jefferson is the last name, who was a graduate of BSc, and they wrote a couple books together, I think nonfiction and fiction, or maybe it was one or the other. Bill Bass is Dr. Bass is a forensic anthropologist who founded the Body Farm in Knoxville, Tennessee, so he's a bit of a celebrity in the forensic anthropology world. And they were doing a question and answer session, and at that question and answer session at Birmingham Southern, somebody was asking about how to identify the race of the individual, especially if they were had different ancestries. If they're a mixed race individual, how could he say with confidence what the race of the individual was? And I think the question was leading towards, is it more difficult now that there are a lot more people with mixed ancestries? And his comment was, well, I really just look at the features, and we have our rules about different features that are prominent. Yes, thanks, Sarah. It was John Jefferson. I knew it was some J. Jefferson. And he said, I just look at the different features, and then I just make a note as far as if they have these features that are associated with this ancestry. So it was sort of a scientific answer where I'm not really concerned about being correct. I'm just giving the investigators all the information I know, which is similar to the point we were getting in. I just finished grading and made a post on the grades for the trace evidence assignment. Wasn't that due a really long time ago, Doctor? Yeah, it was, but there was a lot of people in the class. It took me a while to get through it. The fingerprint assignment will be graded quicker. And it's a matter of where, if you're a forensic scientist testifying, you just tell the jury everything you did in your analysis and help interpret it for them, and then they can put that information together with the rest of the information they have that's outside your field of fiber expertise, or in this case, law enforcement can put together the other information they have outside the report from the forensic anthropologist to try to draw some conclusions about who this individual might be. If you're lucky with human remains, what you'll find is with the human remains, there may be fractures or medical devices from surgical procedures. There was a famous case not too long ago where human remains were identified by a serial number on a breast implant that was found associated with human remains. So any type of hip replacement, any type of medical device that has a serial number on it, if that's found with the human remains, then that's very easy for the investigators to look that up, find out who it was in, and then if the person's still missing, taking away the fact that somebody would knock out an individual, steal their hip, and then bury it with some other human remains for whatever purposes. but it's easy to make an identification. Even if it doesn't have a serial number on it, like we can see this jaw, or well, I don't know what bone, but it's wired shut here, obviously from a past break. And what this is supposed to show over here, but it's not a good indicator of, is where a bone has been broken in the past. It, if you do break a bone, then it heals with a scar and an indication that it had been broken in the past. So therefore, unfortunately, I've never had a broken, well, fortunately, I'm sorry. Fortunately, I've never had a broken bone, unfortunately for this lecture. But if I did have, like, if I broke my arm when I was a kid, then my bones would still sort of have an indication that that bone was broken in the past. So if my human remains were found, 6 months after I'm dead, they could look, and they suspected it was Jason Linville, they could look up an x-ray from when I was younger, compare that x-ray to the bones that they recovered, and they would find that, hey, these have this indication that this bone was broken in this exact location, and that's enough for us to be an individual characteristic. Okay, mock case questions, which are coming up on the quiz 4 and final exam. All right, if it's just a biological profile, okay, where it is a male in their 40s, Caucasian, who's, thin and 6 foot or whatever. Okay, well, that could be me, but it could be somebody else with those traits, right? It's the whole other pencils are yellow argument. All right, so you can only say maybe with a biological profile. But if also with the human remains you found a medical implant that you could look up and knew that was implanted in my hip, if I had a hip replacement when I was younger or something, then you could say this is definitely Dr. Linville. Okay, so with forensic anthropology, if we think of the old class characteristics, individual characteristics, there can be individual characteristics that help identify human remains with certainty. All right, time of death, you're not going to find any certainty here, unless the person was killed with a digital wristwatch and it was smashed at the time of their death or something like that. For human remains, the anthropologist is usually called in if soft tissues have decomposed. The medical examiner will usually be responsible if a body's been dead for, like about a week or 2 weeks. But if it gets to where it passes through the bloat and decay stage and, sort of the body pops from the gases and the maggots have consumed all the soft flesh and you're left with mainly just skeletal remains, then it goes to the forensic anthropologist. And when all of the soft tissue is gone, it can be very difficult for the forensic anthropologist to estimate a time of death. So I think this is a true-false question on one of these quizzes and exams. And the question is, can a forensic anthropologist estimate the time of death to a period of, within 1 to 2 days, or even 1 to 2 weeks, or 1 to 2 months? And no matter what those time periods are, the answer is no, or not with certainty. They can take a guess. Another case that involves Bill Bass, which is not one that came up at Birmingham Southern, but is one from one of the books and stories told about Bill Bass, is he was at or he was asked to help out with a case of human remains that were found on a farmhouse in Tennessee, I think, or Kentucky or someplace like that. And they wanted to know how old the human remains were, how long they had been buried. So Bill Bass looked at them, and they were in really good quality. And he said, well, based on my experience, I'd say, 6 months to 2 years. These looked like they were recently buried. And as the investigators did some more searching of the crime scene, they found that these bones were actually, recovered with, I think it was like some type of ammunition from the Civil War era. And they did more investigating and found that the house that the human remains were found behind used to be a makeshift hospital during the Civil War, where soldiers were treated, and many of them died and were buried in a unmarked graveyard where these human remains were found. And they did some more searching. They found other human remains as well. And when Dr. Bass was asked to comment on his initial estimation of 6 months to 2 years, he said, well, I was only 150 years off. And again, he wasn't really worried about the accuracy. It was a matter of where he looked at the human remains, and based on what he had seen in his previous work and what was written in the literature, these bones, just because of the dirt that they were in, were really well preserved. But with the additional evidence, he certainly didn't say, no, that somebody must have killed this man recently and buried them in the Civil War graveyard or anything. It's recognizing that it's very difficult to look at skeletal remains and determine the age of those remains. All right, another thing that a forensic anthropologist might be able to help out with, but not all the time, is helping to determine the cause of death. There in the picture, gunshot wounds, I mean, even you or I may be able to look at a skull and say, hey, I don't think there's supposed to be a hole there. Maybe it was formed from a bullet. And forensic anthropologists can do this too, but they can also tell the difference between a skull that has just sort of naturally been fractured either during the recovery or a skull fracture from a beating versus a skull fracture from a bullet. So they can determine whether breaks were made before death or after death, which gets into that last bullet there. Ante-mortem is before death, post-mortem is after death. And that can help the investigators determine how this person died. Whereas you or I would look at bones and couldn't really tell the difference between a knife wound versus, a coyote chewing on the bones. Forensic anthropologists have a lot more experience, and they know what normal animal activity, normal decomposition of bones look like, so they can identify something's unusual and may be able to trace that back to some type of violent trauma that occurred either before or at the time of death. All right, so it is possible for them to do that. So their final report for the forensic anthropologist includes an estimate of the time of death, although we said take that with a grain of salt. Biological profile, depending on the bones they recovered, can be fairly accurate when it comes to age, biological sex, stature, and race. Any individual characteristics, which this is probably the most important thing, because if there are any individual characteristics and they find medical records from the person that the human remains are suspected to be, then you can make a definite identification of the human remains, which helps out immensely with the case. And then also any evidence of possible cause of death that they notice, anything that's unusual, out of the ordinary when it comes to comparing human remains to normally decomposing human remains, that would also go in their final report. So this can be very helpful to investigators. Here's a couple of links. Some of these might be broken, but the first one there is the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. So I don't know if the For Students page is still there, but you can certainly look up the ABFA and find some more information about becoming a forensic anthropologist, forensic anthropology programs, et cetera, et cetera. And then also American Academy of Forensic Sciences, that second one, has additional information too, although maybe on a different site. And then that last one, which is probably the biggest risk of no longer existing, was a forensic anthropologist made a post about just careers in forensic anthropology, and I thought it was pretty helpful there. Okay, that's it. What I want everybody to do is to stick around briefly, because I see 11 people are here, so I think I missed a couple people, and so I'm going to take attendance. Again, if you have any questions about the lecture or about anything else, feel free to ask those now. And I will answer them while it's recording. And then if you want to stick around and ask me any questions after the recording has stopped, if you think they're too trivial or stupid to be on a recording, then you may do so at that time. All right, Isabel, I got you. Let's see here. All right, Jamie, you're on. You can leave. Jerica, I have you. Let's see here. John Thomas, you've been here before, but let me write you down. All right, Keith, I have you, Keith. Madeline, I have you. Nikki, I have you down. Patrick, I have you down. Sarah, Riley, and Sarah Sudd, I have both of you down. All right, I got everybody for attendance, so you may all leave whenever you want to. Thank you for attending. Hope it wasn't too long. And everybody, don't forget about your project. So far, I've gotten a lot of feedback. Some people stop by to pick up some fingerprint powder or dental stone. If you're doing hair, you can do it with the naked eye. I've gotten a couple questions about that. But don't forget, get that project wrapped up before you leave for Thanksgiving break. You can turn it in late for partial credit, but let's face it, things are going to be nuts after Thanksgiving in the 2 weeks back. So it's probably best that you finish it up while you can. And I mentioned this to a couple students as well. I'll put it on here at the end of the lecture. For the project, especially if you're doing fingerprints, it does not have to have the same detail as a fingerprint assignment. You know, for the fingerprint assignment, it's tough to get a 10. There's a lot of 7s, 8s, and 9s on the fingerprint assignment. You know, same thing for that trace assignment. But this is one where if you do the assignment, you include the necessary photos that I ask for, and I see that you actually put time into doing the work, then you usually get a 10 for it, 10 out of 10. So it's something more to make sure you did it. I'm not that picky about looking for, two of these traits are too similar. I wanted more different traits, you know, -2 points or anything like that. The forensic anthropologist would not do the DNA profile. So Sarah asked about the forensic anthropologist and the DNA profile. Probably the normal chain of custody would be the forensic anthropologist would get first shot at it, because in order to do DNA testing on human remains or on bones, you need to destroy the sample. Okay, it's not like you can stick a needle in a bone and just suck out the bone marrow and then do DNA analysis on that. You actually have to cut into the bone marrow and pulverize that and extract it from bone dust, essentially. So for a lot of DNA labs, it's actually an interesting question, because my hunch is that you would probably send it to a private lab that specializes in doing, or a federal lab like the FBI that specializes in recovering DNA from bones. Like if it happened in Alabama, I don't think Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences has a protocol for recovering DNA from bones. Also, when you're recovering DNA from bones, it tends to be a situation where there's a chance that there's a very tiny amount of DNA in the sample. So your lab needs to be a lot cleaner, I guess, than an ordinary forensic science DNA lab to reduce the chances of contamination. So bones might go into a lab where they do both STR analysis and attempt mitochondrial analysis, and they may actually put on like full body suits with masks before and go into rooms that have been bleached routinely before they do the extraction, because especially when it comes to mitochondrial DNA, contamination of samples is a huge issue, because just the smallest amount of DNA can get into your extraction and can get into your amplification. So yeah, anthropologists would be the first one, but they're not just going to go into the back of their lab and do the DNA analysis. They're going to send it off to a DNA lab that's specifically, set up for bone extractions. That's a good question. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here. Feel free to keep the questions coming if you guys want to ask anything about, again, the lecture, assignments, anything else.